Well, what about the census? What's the relationship between these voting restrictions and the census? I mean, the census is about so many things, right? It's about the distribution of resources, and it's about just understanding who we are as Americans. It's about seeing large social trends. What does it have to do with voting rights?
Well, the census is kind of a fundamental pillar of our democracy. It's one of the few functions of the federal government that's actually spelled out and required in the Constitution. We have a total population count of everyone living in the United States every 10 years, and that forms the basis for the allocation of seats in Congress and votes in the Electoral College. And it's kind of one of these institutions of the federal government that until recently was relatively free of political interference. But, we've had an administration that politicizes the NOAA and the weather, the Postal Service, the CDC. And so, the politicization of the census is just one iteration of formerly purely professional, nonpartisan institutions being corrupted by the last administration. The last administration tried to engage in a number of methods, schemes to try to undercount immigrant communities. But the connection that I see is this. The restrictions on voting that we're seeing, they don't affect everyone equally, right? A strict identification requirement doesn't stop most people, doesn't cause a problem for most people in getting to the polls. It's only a particular segment of society for whom that restriction makes life harder. The same is true for, restrictions on voter registration drives. I didn't register at a voter registration drive. I, filled out a form, by myself. But if you look at the demographics of who uses voter registration drives, there are big racial disparities. When I litigated a case in Florida, about 3 times as many Black and Latino voters registered through a registration drive as compared to white voters in Florida. The restrictions that we're seeing don't hit the electorate evenly. They seem almost designed to target exactly those segments of the electorate that are emerging over the last, decade or so. The census controversies are a piece of that because efforts to reduce the participation of immigrants or not count them entirely in the census, that's not going to hit the country evenly. It's going to hit parts of the country more that are more diverse. So states that have larger immigrant communities, areas within states, urban areas that tend to be more diverse, those are the areas that would have been undercounted under the Trump administration's various schemes under the census. And that would have resulted in shifting the balance of political power ever so slightly. But with things so close in this country right now, it makes a meaningful difference.
Well, let me just ask you to elaborate a little bit on this and let me ask the devil's advocate question, which I'm sure that you've heard a million times in court. And that is, aren't we talking about undocumented immigrants here, not just immigrants generally, but people who may have come into the United States without proper approvals or documentation? Why should they be counted in the census if to count them will augment the political power of the regions in which they reside? Isn't that, in a sense, kind of unfairly tilting the balance towards places that have welcomed or sheltered people who don't have documentation?
Well, Congress considered this, the founders considered this, and then Congress has considered it a couple of times since the founding. What the Constitution says is that states receive representation in Congress in accordance with their total populations. And that's without regard to immigration status, to documented status. And the theory basically is that states are responsible for everyone who lives within their borders. They have the obligation of ensuring sort of the health and welfare of everyone who lives within their borders. And they're entitled to representation in the national legislature based on those numbers. That was what the framers decided. There were some, conversations about whether or not they should limit, representation in Congress to the number of voters in each state. And then, of course, if you go back to the founding, that obviously would have excluded women entirely, right? Those kinds of proposals came up again when these issues were revisited after the Civil War. And that was a time of a lot of immigration. A lot of states in the North had large immigrant populations. You didn't have comprehensive federal immigration laws at that point, but a number of states like Massachusetts and New York had certain kinds of immigration exclusions and really essentially deportation practices. And there was a debate that was had at that time. Should those immigrants, some of whom Massachusetts and New York do not even want within their borders, should they have representation? And what Congress decided when it ratified the 14th Amendment after the Civil War was, yes, the rule has been states get representation based on all of the human beings in their borders, and we're not going to change that. So it's something that is a part of our founding document. I understand there are policy arguments that some people have for why we might want to exclude some populations. People are free to make those policy arguments. I disagree with them. But the first problem for them is the Constitution requires that everyone be counted. And if someone wants to change that, you got to change the Constitution.